Turn to item 2, questions, and I call on the Honourable Member for Arbory, Castletown and Malew, Mr Glover.
Gurumai, Dr. I seek to ask the Minister for the Treasury what the total value of unpaid rates across local authorities is, how much of this debt has been passed to coroners for collection, and how much has been paid following action by the coroners in each of the last 3 years. Gurumai.
I call on Siobhan Shaka-Tasky to answer.
Mr President, I'd like to thank the Honourable Member for his question. Due to the complexity of the answer, I've circulated more detailed information to members in order to provide more clarity. The Treasury collects rates on behalf of local authorities on our island, except for Bradden, Onchan and the City of Douglas, who make their own arrangements. Taking the points of the question in order, I can confirm that the total value of unpaid rates across local authorities as at the 15th of March 2023 sits at £3,156,955. A proportion of this debt is historic and has accumulated over several years. With regard to the value of debt passed to coroners for collection, I can confirm a value of £100,670 for the year 2019 to 2020. During 2020 to 2021, no recovery stages took place during the pandemic, and ratepayers were given the option to defer payments. Therefore, no new judgments were issued within 2020-21. During 2021-22, recovery stages were not fully reinstated until the end of the 2021-22 year. As this process is time-bound, all prior small claims procedures had then expired. We therefore restarted the process in 2022-23. During 2019-2020, the amount of rates paid following action via the coroners was £43,557. During 2020-21, the amount of rates paid following action via the coroner was £34,044. And during the rating year 2021-22, the value was £41,665. Thank you, Mr President.
Supplementary, Mr Glover.
Gurumai Ectoren. Given that the collection rates overall in a written answer to Dr Hayward are over 95%, am I right in thinking it's a relatively small number of debtors? And why, therefore, have the coroners not taken action, and is the coroners system fit for purpose?
Minister to reply.
Thank you very much, Mr President. I think the Honourable Member makes a very valid point that most people do pay their rates. They pay them on time, and rates are obviously a very important income for local authorities to provide essential services to their communities. The reasons people may not be able to or not want to pay rates are diverse and need to be looked at in the whole. I think when you look at the rates arrears, they vary due to local authorities, but they particularly hit smaller local authorities more significantly. And as I said in my original answer, some of these debts are historic and go back a number of years. In those cases, often there is a charge on the property so that when it is eventually sold, that money will be returned to the local authority. But obviously that does not help them with their cash flow in the short term. In terms of the roles of coroners, I don't think the system is broken, but I do think it needs improvement. Later on in this order paper, Mr President, we will be increasing coroners' fees and trying to make sure that their services are resourced properly. In a written Tynwald answer to the Honourable Member for Ayr and Michael, Mr Johnston, who submitted it back in February, I did spell out the 3 phases of the work the Treasury is currently undertaking, and also stated that in respect to coroners, Treasury intends to prepare a general public policy consultation document seeking views on the powers, procedures and functions of the coroners. I'm happy to tell this court that we will bring that forward, and we will try to get that policy consultation done prior to the summer recess of Tynwald. Thank you.
Supplementary, Mr Moorhouse.
Thank you, Mr President. With regard to the charges that were made reference to in the previous answer, is it the case when rates aren't paid that that's something that happens almost automatically, so all rates will be paid at some future point? Thank you, Mr President.
Minister to reply.
Thank you very much, Mr President. As I specified, the reason people may not be able to or may decide not to pay rates are quite diverse. Sometimes that can be due to financial hardship. Sometimes that can be due to the fact that those people are no longer occupying the property due to illness or due to having to go into social care. So each of those is very much assessed on its merits. Those cases of rent arrears are referred to the Attorney General's chambers, and then often those will go through the small claims court. In some of the more historic cases where those debts have built up over a period of time, then it may be far more appropriate to assign a charge to the property and they have that returned. But obviously that puts the local authority in the difficult position of not knowing when that extra revenue will be coming in. Thank you.
Supplementary, Mr Glover.
And place on record my thanks to the Treasury Minister for his engagement in the run-up to this and for the information that he's provided. But I know we're going to talk about this later in the sitting, but how are coroners rewarded? And is it a case where they're chasing what may seem small debts in their eyes, but are valuable resources for local authorities? It's not worth their while.
Minister to reply.
Thank you very much, Mr President. The coroners form an integral part of the way we collect debts, enforce court procedures, but also they're an incredibly important part of our tradition. And you know, at Tynwald Day, when the coroners are sworn in, when they take part in the process, that shows their historical importance. I think as our society has developed, so therefore their role in our society and their role in terms of securing debts has changed as well. And they do need that support to evolve, to be better resourced so that they can chase these debts. I think from a coroner's point of view, and Treasury work very constructively with them, they will absolutely recognise that any debt is a debt. Any outstanding debt means that there's less revenue to an individual person or a local authority, and we'll pursue that as much as possible. What we need to do with the consultation that we're planning is to see how we can strengthen that enforcement, but also how I think we as parliamentarians can stress the importance that people who use public services contribute to those, and really, you know, for those people who decide that they don't feel that they need to pay rates, that is wrong. The rates are an intrinsic way that we finance local services and finance local authorities. And really the role of the coroners is in enforcing those actions and getting that money back into those local communities. Thank you.
Supplementary, Dr Hayward.
Thank you, Mr President. I thank the Minister for his detailed answer this morning and for his detailed answer to my written question. And indeed, we've engaged in this over the last few months as well. The Minister acknowledging that this puts pressure on local authorities is significant because it does, in some cases, amount to 5% of the overall expected revenue for those local authorities. I wonder if the Minister could comment on the fact that the deferred payments due to COVID did have an impact, but there are 5 local authorities who actually experienced a higher level of outstanding debt in 21-22, so after the COVID period had finished. And how does his department prioritise which debts that they will collect?
Minister to reply.
Thank you, Mr President. I think the Honourable Member makes a very good point. I mean, obviously during COVID, debt collection was not seen as appropriate when some people were running into quite serious debts. And I think we have managed to catch up a good amount since then, but there's still some legacy issues with that, particularly with some of the historic debts. And talking to local authorities, sometimes those can go back 5 or 10 years and are really quite significant. And sometimes there is no adequate explanation for that either. In terms of prioritising debts, I think what Treasury, in conjunction with the Attorney General's chambers, tries to do is deal with all debts on an equal basis, but obviously some of the more considerable debts that are built over a prolonged period of time. The idea of sending a coroner out to try to get them seems a little bit more inadequate, and if that is not successful, then further action to put a charge on the property will be taken. Thank you.
Supplementary, Mr Moorhouse.
Thank you, Mr President. Is the Minister able to give an indication of what percentage of the non-payments relates to business premises? Thank you.
Minister to reply.
Thank you very much, Mr President. I'm not able to give that right now. I know that the Honourable Member, Mr Speaker, asked a question regarding that previously, and there's a written answer for that on Hansard. The state of business rate rates I think is less of an issue than some of the commercial rates, than some of the residential rates for most of the local authorities. But obviously, when you get to some of the larger authorities, such as Ramsey, Douglas and Onken, it's more of an issue. What I would say is that the number of people who don't or can't pay their rates is relatively small on our island. I think that needs to be borne in mind. But as I've said, for some of the smaller local authorities, this can be an issue, and actually, does need to be dealt with. I've met with the Municipal Association and gone through with them a series of measures that could be brought in. One of those measures that we looked at was whether local authorities themselves could appeal to the Small Claims Court to bring that action in by themselves. But because the charge is to Treasury as the collector of those rates, that's not really an option at the moment. We do collect rates on behalf of local authorities. What we need to do is to see whether that arrangement is still valid, or whether some of the other local authorities would rather collect it from their own on their own behalf, or perhaps could combine with other local authorities to do this on a more commercial basis as we move forward. Thank you.
Final supplementary, Mr Glover.
Gurumai Dr. N, and I think the Minister's just answered what I was going to ask there, because I was going to say welcome and thank him for bringing this review forward. But also, as part of that review, I was going to ask, is Treasury, for the majority of the local authorities, the right organisation to be actually doing this in the first place?
Minister to reply.
Thank you, Mr President. I think the Honourable Member, this is obviously one of the things when I've talked to the rates section, which is a very small number of people who do an exceptionally good job, in my opinion. Is this arrangement still valid? Now, obviously, from the point of some of the smaller local authorities, having somebody else to act on their behalf for a small commission rate of 5% is worthwhile. To look at the logistics of collecting rates and the logistics of enforcing that collection. Moving forward, I think we do need to say, is that still the best model on the Isle of Man? Are there perhaps better models, particularly with digitalisation and using the private sector? And certainly I'm open to that discussion with local authorities as we move forward together. Thank you.
Move on to question 2, and I call on the Honourable Member for Arbory, Castletown, Malew, Mr Moorhouse.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I would like to ask the Minister for Infrastructure what are the costs of repairing the trains damaged in the accident on New Year's Eve. Thank you.
Call on Siobhan Buntraglis.
Thank you, Mr President. We have not received invoices for the repairs to all the carriages as yet, and are also taking the opportunity to upgrade the safety glass used in the carriages. However, indicative costs of the works are in the region of £6,500, including the glass upgrades. The work included replacement of 13 broken or cracked windows, repainting and touch-up repairs to handles, door latches, lamps, and an oil can, which were damaged in the incident.
Mr Moorhouse, supplementary.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and thank you, Minister. In terms of when the incident happened, was there any specific reason why the train continued to run? It appears to be in quite a challenging position in terms of the damage to the plate glass windows. About half of those were damaged. Also, the lighting was running down, and they're actually positioned very close to a main road. Was any action taken to actually get them onto buses? And also in terms of a review, is that being carried out, and what form will it take, and will it be made public? Thank you, Mr President.
Minister to reply.
Obviously, there is an incident report from those directly involved, and I believe subsequently there might well have been an accident report, as would be normal in this sort of incident. To answer the first question, and then lead on to the question of a review, obviously the safety and all the other issues below that were considered on the evening, night, morning, after the DOI emergency services had come to the train and had taken away the tree that had fallen in front of the train when it was travelling around 5 or 10 miles per hour, and made an assessment that the train could carry on to Port Erin, where I believe some people got off, and then to come back again to Douglas. And I did hear the celebratory hoot at 1:30 in the morning as the train arrived back in Douglas. Actually, technical term hoot isn't the proper term, the whistle, I'm very sorry.
Supplementary, Mr Moorhouse.
Thank you, Mr President, and thank you, Minister. In terms of the cost outlined, the figure 6,500, in terms of that figure, is that for the costs that are being paid for so far, or is it for the total costs that we're looking at this moment? Because the figure does look quite low compared with the damage that was done to the train on the evening. And in terms of the learning and the changes that have taken place as a result of the incident, have any actions been taken to reduce similar accidents happening in the future? Thank you, Mr. President.
Minister to reply.
Thank you, Mr. President, and for the supplementary question. I indicated it was indicative costs for the whole of the work, but obviously I did say it was subject to invoices, so I hope I won't be held to have misled the House if it's slightly more than that. My understanding is that's the actual amounts paid out in relation to this whole incident, which is now considered an accident. Obviously there will be other labour involved, which won't be included in that amount, because that's the way that these things works. In terms of the cause of the accident, let's say it was a tree that was fallen down. This is in a cutting between Ballabeg Station and Ballinorris Bridge, and alongside that cutting there are 19 significant trees. Those on the south side were all approximately 3 metres from the nearest running rail and are deemed to pose a risk to passing trains. The trees at Ballabeg had been the subject of a permit application to DEFA for cutting trees down, with permission only being granted for the felling of 3 of those trees. Unfortunately, the tree that fell down wasn't one of those 3 trees, but constantly we are looking at making sure that we have safe operations of our heritage rail. We will learn lessons from this episode. There was also the incident around the lights, which came up in the incident report, which was subject to an FOI request, and I believe it seems like people behaved properly and replaced the lights that were damaged with the LED strip earlier on in the journey. Finally, I just want to thank everybody involved in the incident, because I think there was a great professionalism even amongst the travelling public on the carriages. They obviously had good wine and good food because of the nature of their journey that evening, but I think everybody was very relaxed, and I think it was a fine evening that was had despite the incident. Unfortunately, little damage was done and nobody was hurt. I had the privilege of having a live commentary at certain points of it, because by chance my trooper wife let us go along to the control room at 1:45 midnight, and I do feel as if I might have brought bad luck, because the tree fell down just after I'd arrived in the control room, but I'm assured it wasn't staged for the Minister's edification.
Final supplementary, Mr Moorhouse.
Thank you, Mr. President, and thank you, Minister. In terms of the trees that have been identified, 3 had issues. Have all those 3 trees now been removed? And in terms of the other trees, given this was a tree that was given an okay overview, are the other trees being reviewed? Because presumably that's raised concerns. Also on the evening of the accident, 2 people actually raised concerns about the way in which there was a concerted effort to ensure that photographs weren't taken and information wasn't going onto social media. A lot of people felt slightly unnerved by this. Is this part of the policy, or was that a recommendation of the people in the train that evening? And also in terms of supervision by senior management, was that actually taking place? We've heard from the Minister there that he was actually at headquarters when this happened, and he'd be able to see all the guidance that was given. In terms of what he saw, were senior officials there and able to provide the help and support at that time? And given how close they were to a main road, was the option of using buses to collect them considered? Thank you, Mr. President.
Minister to reply.
Thank you, Mr. President. I only was in the control room because obviously there were night buses that evening, and there had been a bit of controversy about the night buses, so it seemed only fair that the Minister should go along and actually see how the operation of night buses was featuring. I wasn't there because of the very enjoyable dining train that was on its New Year's Eve journey. I did have the chance to talk with some of the passengers. It's my understanding that the episode that might suggest and might be spun to suggest there was in any way control was something like the waiter saying, you've got really good food and wine, why worry yourselves? Let the professionals get on with it and focus on the food and the wine rather than anything more sinister than that. But if it was in any way more sinister than that, I'm sure that has come to light in the accident review. And I do hope that the people who chose to get off in Port Erin had a good evening, and likewise those who were on the train waited up to hear the whistle as it came back by my house at 1:30 also had a good evening. And if there are any issues, I'm sure they will have been dealt with. In terms of cutting back trees, the department takes its obligations very, very seriously in respect of trees that might fall on trains or might fall on buses or might even fall on cars on highways. And we do have major proposals in that space which we're working with DEFRA in terms of permission and also in terms of budget to deal with, and you can expect some announcements about that in the future.
Move on to question 3. I call on the Honourable Lauder.
Good morning, Lecturer. I beg leave to ask the Minister for Infrastructure when he expects to consult on regulations regarding minimum standards for private rental properties.
Call on Bishop on Troglos.
Thank you, Mr. President. All of the supporting regulations of the Landlord Registration Private Housing Act 2021, including minimum standards for private rental properties, are part of the Housing and Communities Board Department of Infrastructure work stack, which are prioritised according to need and are of course subject to available resources. The honourable questioner will know of course that given section 75 of that particular piece of legislation, which was an amendment from yours truly, parts 2, 3 and 4 of that legislation can't be brought into force until those regulations are made. The Housing Communities Board is developing an occupancy deposit scheme. To that end, it formed an occupancy deposit subgroup in September 2022, which has agreed to basic principles for the development of an occupancy deposit scheme. The Housing and Communities Board are working with estate agents and the Manx Landlord Association to an extent on a number of work streams, but to date it has not commenced specific work on either further specifying at least, or enhancing the minimum standards. Therefore, I cannot provide a time frame for when consultation can be expected to commence on the minimum standards. However, of course, at least the enhancement of standards will be by the leading department responsible for each of those standards. So a cross-government programme will need to be put together for engagement, just like it was between 2014 and 2017 when the standards were put in place that enabled the bringing into force of houses in multiple occupation and new flats regulations. And that is work underway and will be seen by this honourable place and the general public in the second year's action plan of the Housing Communities Board.
Supplementary, Lauder.
Yeah, good morning, Lecturer. Readers of the Housing Communities Board plan could be forgiven that this would have been work undergone in 22-23. So could the Minister perhaps be pushed into providing a commitment as to when these will be out to consultation, perhaps even this year, this financial year? Because without at least some form of timescale, there's going to be doubts about the Department's commitment to delivering on this piece of legislation.
Minister to reply.
I think I already did give that commitment in the first answer. I did say that the standards would be part of the engagement this year as part of the second year Housing and Communities Action Plan. And there's full commitment to further specifying the minimum standards, demystifying those standards, and then actually bringing into force regulations such that the parts 2, 3 and 4 of the Landlord Registration Private Housing Act can be brought into force. Part 6, which is the one to do with occupancy deposit, was intended to go first, but in discussion with estate agents, property management companies and with the Manx Landlord Association, it seems that we need to bring both the occupancy deposit and the minimum standards into force at the same time.
On to question 4. I call on the Honourable Member for Arbory, Castletown, Malew, Mr Moorhouse.
Thank you, Mr. President. I would like to ask the Minister for Infrastructure what data was collected about the number of people using the toilets on Back Hope Street, Castletown, in the 6 months before they closed. Thank you.
Call on Bishop on Troglos to reply.
Thank you, Mr. President. The Department did not and does not hold any data on the number of people that used the Castletown bridge toilets as they were leased to and managed by Castletown town commissioners prior to them closing. I doubt whether Castletown town commissioners have any data about the number of people using a particular toilet block, but hey-ho. The department and Castletown town commissioners have since entered into a 12-month licence which enabled the toilet block to be reopened from the week commencing the 6th of March 2023.
Supplementary, Mr Moorhouse.
Thank you, Mr President, and thank you, Minister. The last line is particularly positive. But going back to the statement that was released in December about the toilets being closed, reference was made to it being not a required facility. What was that actually based on if there was no actual data suggesting it wasn't a required facility? There must have been something that was suggesting it wasn't. So what data was it based on? Thank you, Mr President.
Minister to reply.
So that's a partial quote from what the government spokesman said. What the government spokesman said was that these toilets at the Qualtroad end of the harbour were not required facilities for harbour users who have another toilet below the harbour keepers, alongside the harbour keeper's office. It's easy to mix up when you've been to so many harbour keepers alongside the harbour keeper's office in Castletown. So therefore, the harbour keeper's office in Castletown, alongside it, has required facilities for harbour users. They need some work on them, in fact, but they are there. And these public toilets along the road towards Malew, Janet's Corner, very important for coach travellers. Wouldn't it be great if there was disabled, fully accessible toilets in Castletown?
Yeah.
Those toilets, they're a challenge for Castletown commissioners because they're public toilets, and I'm absolutely delighted that the clerk and the commissioners in Castletown have risen to that challenge and delighted to put in place a 12-month licence for them to enable the transfer with covenant that they should be toilets. And I hope very much that the Department for Enterprise, the Manx Lottery Trust and everybody else who can possibly support them will support them to put in place excellent toilets that can be useful for the tourist facilities and the facilities for locals inside Castletown.
Supplementary, Mr Moorhouse.
Thank you, Mr President, and thank you, Minister. With regard to the harbour keepers' toilets, are they actually open most of the day as the toilets we're talking about are open for a significant amount of time? And also, with regard to those toilets, is there any data in terms of the usage? The Minister makes reference to the actual state of them not being quite as good as we would expect. And also, just in terms of moving things forward, is the department really serious about ensuring that the Castletown commissioners can actually get the best results from this? Thank you, Mr President.
Yeah,
the
Castletown principle is a wonderful principle, and it should be applied more often around the island. The Thomas Mackenzie line has been drawn in the sand, and the Department of Infrastructure Harbours Division is very well prepared to work with all the commissioners about the toilets that are in the harbour area that are used by the public. Alongside that, it will make sure that it works for the harbour users to provide facilities, showers and toilets and all the other things that local and visiting harbour users need. And so there's a statement of intent. I think Castletown has showed the way for so many other commissioners around the island that if they're serious about working together, we're absolutely serious about working together. And I hope somebody like the Manx Lottery Trust can reward Castletown commissioners for getting in there quickly to begin to provide fully accessible facilities for visitors and locals alike. It's a difficult place to provide toilets in Castletown because they get vandalised from time to time, but we've got lots of experience of running toilets, hundreds of them in the Department of Infrastructure, and we're there for advice. And with my hat on as local government, I'm very much looking forward to sharing the load with another minister to actually work out how we can transfer these toilets to Castletown commissioners with a covenant on them such that they have to stay public facility. And if Peel Town commissioners want to talk about their toilets, and Ramsey Town commissioners want to talk about their toilets, and Laxey want to talk about their toilets, I'm your man.
Thank you, Minister. We'll now move on to question 5 and call on the Honourable Member for Arbory, Castletown, Malew, Mr Moorhouse.
Thank you, Mr President. I would like to ask the Minister for Education, Sport and Culture how many teachers in her department's schools are 1 over 50 years old and 2 over 55 years old, and what proportion these figures represent of teaching staff overall. Thank you.
Call on Shaveshak, Inseat Sport as Culture to reply.
Thank you, Mr President. I can confirm that there are currently 110 teachers between the ages of 50 and 55 years old who are inclusive working within the department's schools. There are also 92 teachers who are 56 years old and over who work within the department's schools. As a proportion, this makes up approximately 25% of teaching staff within the department's schools. I'd also like to advise that in line with the Isle of Man Government's Retirement Policy 2018 and the Equality Act 2017, the Department does not operate a compulsory retirement age. Thank you, Mr President.
Supplementary, Mr Moorhouse.
Thank you, Mr President, and thank you, Minister. The figures look slightly more healthy than some figures that were recently released via a union. In terms of the 25% figure, is the Minister happy with that data? Thank you, Mr President.
Minister to reply.
Thank you, Mr President, and I'm pleased to say that those figures are correct as of today. We have 818 teachers in our schools and we have 35 across other services. With regards to whether I'm happy with them, we certainly are under no disillusion around recruitment, and we don't have any issues around recruitment. However, out of our staff of 818, it's 25%.
Supplementary, Mr Moore.
Thank you, Mr President, and thank you, Minister. In terms of the age structure of the teaching on the Isle of Man, is any active research, any active analysis ongoing, or is it something that's kind of looked at periodically as and when, for example, if a Tynwald question is asked? And in terms of the stickability of those staff under 50, is that considered in terms of those who are actually staying here, who are retrained to go into the professions, or actually leaving the island? Thank you, Mr President.
Minister to reply.
Thank you, Mr President. Obviously, the Department is constantly looking at its staffing and staffing structures with regards to our employees. However, as I've stated in my original answer, under the Equality Act, obviously there is no fixed retirement age. With regards to stickability of our newly qualified teachers, teachers under 30 currently make up 17% of our workforce. This compares to 20% 5 years ago. And the Department doesn't have any concerns regarding this. As for newly qualified teachers, the age range for this can vary, as people can retrain and become a teacher at any point in their career. Thank you, Mr President.
Good news there.
Move on to question 6. I call on the Honourable Member for Arbory, Castletown, Malew, Mr Moorhouse.
Thank you, Mr President. I would like to ask the Minister for Health and Social Care how many special care dental services are provided, how many dentists can provide these services, and how many procedures they can carry out each week. Thank you.
Call on Siobhan Slant Crail Atia to reply.
Special care dental services are provided by Manx Care's Community Dental Service, with care being delivered in a variety of ways and within different settings. The service provides domiciliary care, inhalation sedation services, paediatric and adult general anaesthetic services via Nobles Hospital, and a preschool assessment service. Special care services are provided via referral only for people who are unable to accept routine dental care due to some physical, intellectual, medical, emotional, sensory, mental or social impairment, or a combination of these factors. The Community Dental Service also provides a dental service at the Isle of Man Prison and provides a Monday to Friday emergency dental service for patients who do not have access to a dentist. Neither of these services would constitute special care. There are currently 2 qualified special care dentists, with a third to be recruited. 2 other dentists currently working at the Community Dental Service are developing their skills within special care, which will enable more inhalation sedation procedures to be offered and reducing waiting times for patients. Progression with further special care qualifications will commence in the future, which will broaden the skill set within the current team of dentists and give the ability to deliver more as we transform dental services across wider Manx Care. Special care dentistry in general takes a lot longer to deliver than a regular dental service due to the complexity of patient needs. On average, each special care dentist will see between 5 and 9 patients a day, or between 25 to 45 patients a week. This figure does not include the emergency patients that are seen by the special care dentists, and the figure will fluctuate depending on the complexity of the patients and the treatment they require. Some patients will attend for one procedure, others for multiple procedures, either within one appointment or multiple appointments, dependent on the individual and the procedures they require.
Supplementary, Mr Moorhouse.
Thank you, Mr President, and thank you, Minister. Is the Minister able to give us some indication of the waiting times that are currently being expected to be carried out. A lot of these are very young and vulnerable people, and the waiting times have been suggested to be quite long. Is there any maximum wait that is in place? And in terms of moving things forward, is this an area that's being looked at? Thank you, Mr. President.
Minister to reply.
Thank you, Mr. President. As I outlined in my original answer, the service is in the process of upskilling the existing dentistry team and recruiting additional special care dentists to try and increase capacity and deal with throughput. In terms of waiting times, as I explained in my original answer, the special care dentistry service provides a wide range of services, so domiciliary care, treatments, paediatrics, there's a lot of things they do, so waiting lists will be different depending on exactly what element of service the Honourable Member is talking about.
Supplementary, Mr. Moorhouse.
Thank you, Mr. President, and thank you, Minister. I think the core concern is relating to some of the people having to wait several months for treatment, and that is potentially causing concern. Is that something that the Minister is seeing in his data set, or are the more urgent cases being dealt with quickly and other things as and when? Thank you, Mr. President.
Minister to reply.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'll try and help the Honourable Member here. Having seen his Facebook post, I think he's talking very specifically about general anaesthetic treatment for children. So in terms of that, the wait times can vary between 8 days for the shortest that's been seen to in excess of 7 or 8 months, depending on the complexity of the patient. So I suppose the short answer is yes, there can be some considerable wait times because of the complexity of the procedures and the type of treatment that is needed. You need to make sure when you're dealing with anaesthetics for children, for example, that there is space in the children's ward, that the theatre at Nobles has space, all the relevant people are available, and actually that can be difficult to arrange sometimes. But as I think some of the figures show, where those needs are urgent and need to be met immediately, there is capacity to book urgent waiting lists to have urgent sessions done. But again, that really will depend on the nature of the treatment that is needed and the complexity of the individual patients.
We move on to question 7. I call on the Honourable Member Arbory Castletown Malew, Mr. Moorhouse. Okay.
Thank you, Mr. President. I would like to ask the Chairman of the Manx Utilities Authority what the costs are of installing in a new house and a smart electricity meter, and B, a traditional electricity meter. Thank you.
Call on Carlett Bunch of Aisham Bannon to reply.
Thank you, Mr. President. The cost to install a domestic electricity meter is £20.15, which applies to both smart and traditional meters if installed on a like-for-like programme basis. We gain a cost efficiency when multiple meters are installed at the same time and location, as we are doing with our smart metering programme. Thank you.
Supplementary, Mr. Moorhouse.
Thank you, Mr. President, and thank you, Chair. Last month, the Chair suggested that 289 all-star meters have been installed in the last 12 months. And the issue was in terms of the smart electric meters not being installed due to the development phase of the back-office systems to support those smart meters. In terms of moving forward, have those back-office works now been completed, or is there a date when they will be completed? Thank you, Mr. President.
Chair to reply.
Thank you, Mr. President. Back-office systems have to go through a complete testing and validation exercise before they can be utilised in a real-world environment in which we engage with our customers. These systems go from conception through testing, regression and flow evaluation before they go live. And so each part of the system has to be validated before the next part of the system can be proved. As previously explained, because we needed to focus on the obsolete key meter system, we chose to focus essential resource on that process rather than on validating a system which is planned to complete later in the programme. Some of the experience we have gained with the pay-as-you-go system is being introduced into the credit system, and in particular within the app, in order to improve the customer experience. It is currently anticipated that the credit meter rollout will be ready to commence in May this year, subject to successful validation testing. Thank you.
Supplementary, Mr. Moorhouse.
Thank you, Mr. President, and thank you, Chair. In terms of the predicted date of May, from May onwards, will all the newly installed meters be of a smart meter type? And in terms of the geographical area across the island, will there be a specific rollout programme? Thank you very much, Mr. President.
Chair to reply.
Thank you, Mr. President. It's impossible to tell exactly when the final meter will be installed. For information, we have only got 150 of the old-style meters left in stock, which demonstrates effective use of assets already purchased, and so the final meter installation is not that far away. In the main, we will continue to utilise the stock as replacement stock if we discover that an old meter has become faulty. Hopefully the testing of our back-office systems will coincide with the large batch of meters which may be required in a new development. It must be noted that there are always some small legacy issues which need to be addressed when transitioning from the use of one major system to another. Ultimately, all of our legacy meters will be replaced within the programme time frame. It remains our plan to replace batches of meters on a regional basis because that is the most cost-efficient process. Thank you.
Final supplementary, Mr Moorhouse.
Thank you, Mr President. Thank you, Chair. With regard to the 150 traditional meters that are in stock, some people are actually concerned about having smart meters installed, and previously it's been indicated that some people have the option to have the traditional meters. Is this the last 150 metres we will ever get, or will there be additional supplies coming through for those people who are prepared to pay more for this traditional option? Thank you, Mr President.
Chair to reply.
Thank you, Mr President. Well, no one will be paying more for the traditional choice, but ultimately, no, this is the last now. The whole point is that these meters are no longer made. We are now transitioning to a new system. That is the basic fact of the situation. So no, going forward, all meters will have to be replaced. If people are concerned about having a meter replaced, then obviously we're happy to reach out and have further conversation. But ultimately, over the next 2-3 years, all meters will be getting replaced. And so far, 6,000 of the prepaid meters have now been replaced.
Move on to a final question, question 8, and I call on the Honourable Member of Arbory, Castletown, Malew, Mr Moorhouse.
Thank you, Mr President. I would like to ask the Chairman of the Manx Utility Authority if he will make a statement on the feed-in rate and the variable increases in charges due to take place on the 1st of April 2023.
I call on the Carlach, Bun Shavashan Vannon to reply.
Thank you, Mr President. Honourable members will be aware that earlier in the month, Manx Utilities announced its tariffs for 2023. In summary, this was a general 9.8% inflationary increase in all tariffs based on Manx consumer price inflation for the 12-month period that ended September 2022, and a 12 pence per kilowatt hour increase on electricity unit rates being implemented in 2 stages. The 12 pence per unit increase was to reflect the exceptional increases in wholesale gas and energy supply costs over the last 12 months, which have an equal impact on all tariffs. For 2022, a percentage increase was applied for simplicity, and the further significant increases in wholesale energy costs led to our lowest rate tariffs being lower than the marginal cost of supplying units of electricity. With regard to the export unit rate that Manx Utilities pays customers with surplus generation, it was decided to increase this unit rate by the general inflationary rate of 9.8%. This decision was based on Manx Utilities seeking to pay a fair rate for surplus generation that a customer cannot use themselves to support their cost of installation, but also to minimise the risk that our other customers subsidise private renewable installations when such private renewable installations are excessive for a customer's own needs. Thank you, Mr President.
Supplementary, Mr Moorhouse.
Thank you, Mr President, and thank you, Chair. Just focused on that last section in terms of the feed-in rate, what level of consideration was actually given to increasing that rate? There was some general input given in the closing remarks, but is it something that is being looked at going forward, even though it may be challenging to at this moment in time? Thank you, Mr President.
Chair to reply.
Thank you, Mr President. The sustainable generation export rates are not remaining constant, but have been increased by 9.8%. These unit rates are not linked to wholesale energy costs in the same manner as Manx Utilities' energy purchases to meet local demand are. Manx Utilities' export rate have previously been determined to be generous and remain higher than those currently offered by UK energy retailers. It was not appropriate to increase these unit rates by 12 pence per kilowatt hour due to the current high level, and this would result in windfall rewards for customers who have already invested in renewable generation and are benefiting from avoiding the general tariff increase. Thank you.
Supplementary, Mr Moorhouse.
Thank you, Mr President, and thank you, Chair. It's interesting that. In terms of the domestic comfy heating rate, that's one that's kind of appealing to the poorer people out there and the more money-conscious people. In terms of that being supporting these people, was any consideration given to actually keeping that at a lower level rather than moving to at the same rate? Thank you, Mr. President.
To reply.
Thank you, Mr. President. A wider range of considerations was given to the tariff increase before it was announced. Whilst it would have been possible to apply different increases to different tariffs, there would have to be a reasoning as to why one tariff was being given preferential treatment over another. The objective of the tariff increase was to ensure Manx Utilities had sufficient funding to meet its financial commitments, including the purchasing of energy from its suppliers. Freezing a tariff would have meant increases on other tariffs would have had to be made, had to be higher, and the likely result to customers on the frozen tariffs being subsidised by our other customers. Thank